Good morning. Good morning. It's always a pleasure to journey to Korea and participate in the NEREC conferences. I've been involved from the very beginning, so this is my fifth time participating in this wonderful event. I'm a big fan, and I think those of you who are students in this program are really getting quite amazing opportunity to learn a lot and experience a lot. I was asked to prepare some remarks about some aspect of the global nuclear proliferation scene. What I would like to do is spend my time, asked to speak for 45 minutes, talking about what seems to me a kind of puzzle. And the puzzle is that Iran and North Korea, these two famous cases, have dominated the non-proliferation agenda for at least a quarter of a century, going back into the early 1990s, and arguably even further back. And as we can see from every day's headlines and blogs and Twitter feeds, they remain very prominent on the international agenda, and in fact remain at the core of our non-proliferation concerns. Now, there are lots of other issues that we can, should, and do care about in the non-proliferation realm, the changing patterns of nuclear power, the occasional interest in fuel cycle capabilities on the part of emerging powers, the confrontation, the regular confrontation in the politics of the NPT between the haves and the have-nots, between the North and the South, between those arrayed with the United States and those on the other side of the global divide. So this is not the only set of issues, but it is a particularly significant and difficult and protracted set of challenges on the international agenda. And what is the puzzle? The puzzle, in my mind, is that in our attempts to deal with Iran and North Korea as nuclear non-proliferation challenges, we have persisted for 25 years with an approach which I would call coercive non-proliferation. And what this 25 years has represented, I think, is a very protracted demonstration of the limits of coercive non-proliferation. Now, what do I mean by coercive non-proliferation? It usually involves three ingredients. One is military threats, which we have seen repeatedly in both the Iran and North Korean cases, in which every American president invokes the standard American line, every option is on the table, which is meant to convey that the use of force is not out of the question. Secondly, sanctions of one sort or another. And thirdly, efforts to diplomatically isolate and ostracize the target states. And with varying degrees and mixes across administrations and across international constellations of alignment, this is the approach we've taken toward North Korea and Iran. We now have a new administration in the United States, very controversial in some respects, very provocative in some respects. But in this domain, it is in fact pursuing a policy that has a lot of continuity. It's essentially a particularly aggressive form of coercive non-proliferation. And President Trump has repeatedly suggested that because he is tougher and shrewder, and because his threats are more credible, and because his efforts to coerce will be more comprehensive and more fierce, that his coercive non-proliferation policy will produce the results that others have failed to achieve in the past. So we're having an experiment here. We'll see how that test goes. And of course, as a parenthesis, there's a substantial suspicion in the United States that the true aim of the Trump coercive policy toward Iran is not really to achieve non-proliferation objectives, but to provoke or cause regime change in Iran. That would then change the dynamics of the analysis considerably. I'm going to focus here on the question of achieving non-proliferation aims. The goal, of course, is to put pressure on the target states. And the goal of that pressure is to convert it into major non-proliferation results. And one can see, in fact, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the famous Iran deal that President Trump has now withdrawn the United States from, as an example of this, that the United States and its friends and allies worked very hard to put pressure on Iran. They were then able to take this pressure and convert it into an agreement in which Iran had incentives to make concessions and to cooperate in the achievement of a mutually beneficial deal. But in general, if you look at the impact across 25 years of efforts at coercive diplomacy, what one can see is that we have hurt our targets, we have inconvenienced them, we've slowed their programs, we've raised the cost of their programs, we've punished them for pursuing policies that we find objectionable, but we have failed to achieve our non-proliferation objectives. We've had very clear objectives. In the Iran case, it was to prevent Iran's enrichment program. President George W. Bush said many times, not a single centrifuge will spin. That's the goal of American policy. And of course, because the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, allowed Iran 5,000 centrifuges, those who believed that 0 centrifuges was the only acceptable outcome rejected the agreement. With the case of North Korea, of course, after the nuclear tests, the goal became to freeze and roll back North Korea's nuclear and missile programs. And as we've seen over the last year or two with multiple nuclear tests and nearly 12.5 missile tests since the beginning of the Trump administration, we have failed to achieve those objectives. Well, the United States is a very powerful actor in this system. And we're part of a coalition with our NATO and Asian allies that is the most powerful coalition in the history of the planet. And we have hugely disproportionate market power in the global economy, not only because we and our friends and allies are very rich, but also because we dominate the financial system, which makes the whole international order work. So how is it that over a 25-year period, with strenuous exertions, I don't think anybody would argue, for example, that the George W. Bush administration was not trying very, very hard to coerce Iran and North Korea into giving up their WMD programs. How can it be that we have failed? What's gone wrong? Isn't this something of a puzzle? So I'm going to try and assess that question and provide a bit of an answer. And what I'm going to sketch is an analysis that zeroes in on 6 factors that, as I see it, looking back across this history and having lived through it and having been deeply involved in both of studying and participating in both of these struggles over a very long time, 6 factors that impede the successful implementation or utilization of coercive diplomacy. The first of these 6 is that there exist in the world divergent perceptions of the target states. For the United States, it's very clear, Iran is evil. Iran is the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. Iran, since 1979, has been right at the top of America's list of undesirable states, hostile powers. Some of our friends and allies share these views. But many other parties in the international system don't see it that way at all. And in fact, at the very time that the George W. Bush administration was trying very hard to completely isolate and ostracize Iran, it was elected to head the non-aligned movement, a coalition of approximately 120 member states. So totally intolerable to the Bush administration and completely acceptable to 2/3 of the international community. Well, that creates a political environment that's not conducive to our policy. We see a similar, although somewhat narrower dynamic in the North Korean case. The United States views North Korea as one of the most irrational and hence dangerous rogue states on the planet, one that now has violated our preferences by acquiring nuclear weapons and the means to deliver them, and now even the means possibly to deliver them against the United States, and engages in all kinds of nefarious behavior, black market activities, sales of sensitive military and WMD technology around the world, and so on. And this is a regime that, in Washington's eyes, simply needs to be stopped. Very simple. For China, North Korea is a longtime ally, an ideological soulmate, an economic partner that has been deeply integrated with China. I don't believe that Beijing wants North Korea to have nuclear weapons. I don't believe that it approves of every provocative act that North Korea makes. But its view of Pyongyang is very different from that exists in Washington. Well, the upshot is that our policies, the United States and others who join us in these efforts to engage in coercive non-proliferation, these can cause many problems and complications for the target states. But those states have lots of room for maneuver. And what's going on here is that we're trying to isolate and ostracize Iran and North Korea. And they're trying, each in their own way and each with their own options, to avoid isolation and ostracization. We have a strategy to isolate them, and they have a powerful incentive and many options for defeating our strategy. So to me, that's reason number one why there are limits on our ability to successfully engage in coercive non-proliferation. Reason number two has to do with the nature of our objectives. And this gets somewhat into the politics of the non-proliferation regime. To a very large extent, and this is extremely clear in the case of Iran, our objective has been to try to stop those states from engaging in permitted activities. Enrichment is allowed under the NPT. Reprocessing is allowed under the NPT. It's very clear from the negotiating history, from the ratification history, even in the United States, from past practice, from precedent, that non-weapon states can reprocess, enrich, accumulate inventories of fissile material. They can have even high levels of enrichment, so-called HEU, provided this is done under IAEA safeguards. This, in the eyes of many non-nuclear weapon states, is part of the entitlement that they were promised under Article 4 of the NPT, that is the one that allows non-weapon states to have access to the full array of nuclear technologies for civilian purposes under safeguards. Of course, that's always the very important caveat. Some people will argue, well, but Article 4 doesn't specifically mention enrichment, and therefore, even though it says the fullest possible access, which is pretty hard to argue is a restrictive clause, nevertheless, there's no guarantee there of enrichment. Anyone who makes that argument simply hasn't bothered to read Article 3, Paragraph 3 of the NPT, which actually does mention enrichment as a right that should not be abridged even for purposes of safeguards. We also have very strident objections to the missile programs of both Iran and North Korea. And there's accusations regularly against Iran, for example, that it's violating something by testing its missiles. Now, there is nothing on this planet of a global nature, a treaty, a regime, anything, that prohibits states from having missiles, ballistic or otherwise. The leading missile state in the world is the United States, which has a zillion different kinds of missiles, which conducts countless missile tests, and which we regard as perfectly normal behavior by a state seeking to achieve its own security. When you have missiles, you must test. This is not only normal, it's necessary to have a meaningful missile program. So having a missile test in every other context, other than North Korea and Iran, is regarded as ordinary behavior of a sort that has to happen if you're going to have missiles. In the case of North Korea, literally every time it tests a missile, the United States runs to the UN Security Council and asks for a condemnation on the grounds that this is a threat to international peace and security. Well, this is understandable from a policy point of view because we find this behavior objectionable and we see it as threatening to ourselves and our allies and friends. But viewing it from a wider international canvas, this looks like a huge double standard. The United States can have a profusion of missiles and a zillion missile tests, and we can provide missiles to all of our friends and allies, but anyone who tries to defend themselves against the threat from us is condemned as a threat to international peace and security. Even the issue of nuclear tests, of course, the North Korean nuclear tests have produced deep condemnation in Washington. And of course, we find it distressing, the United States and others allied to us, very distressing at evidence that North Korea's nuclear weapons program is making progress. This is understandably disturbing, right? But we then have these histrionic reactions to these missile tests, these nuclear tests when North Korea does them, without taking into account that the United States has conducted 1,054 nuclear tests, and that we are, in fact, the world's leading opponent of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which has been denounced by the US Senate and rejected by multiple presidents of the United States, keeping the CTBT from going into effect, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. So we can both test up the wazoo, as we say in the United States, and we can reject the international multilateral treaty that would ban nuclear testing, but when North Korea conducts a test, we rush to the United Nations and ask for a sanctioned resolution on the grounds that this is a threat to international peace and security. Well, so you can see how in the politics of the NPT system, these kinds of double standards might play in a difficult way. And so you find, for example, the Egyptians, who in every other way are at cross purposes from Iran, backing Iran on the Article 4 question. If you look at the representations of the non-aligned movement, which if you count both members and observers, I think is more than 130 states. It's literally 2/3 of the international system. They oppose the American position on Article 4. They oppose the American interpretation of these behaviors, because they are permitted activities under the system, and they're declared objectionable simply because the United States and its friends and allies don't like them. Well, I think that's another impediment to our successful achievement of coercive non-proliferation when other parties do not regard our objectives as legitimate. And just one more footnote here that pertains particularly to North Korea.